Yeah, I would say to me, like the impact that we as designers can have is to relentlessly sort of be the voice of the users and get other disciplines thinking in the same way. But it's hard because, I think to me design thinking is not really a process so much as a mindset.
Welcome to Design Drives, your audio experience about what, how, and why design drives things forward. A podcast hosted by Sebastian Gier, together with forward-thinking design practitioners from around the world. Enjoy the episode.
This episode we talk with Siri Johansson, a designer that got excellent knowledge and experiences in both physical and digital design, building up on her knowledge working in consultancies like IDEO and her new in-house role at Spotify. We talk about the intersection of industrial and interaction design, her inspiring journey, and where she sees design is going, both on an overall level and in the design process of future entertainment services. One of my absolute favorite episodes so far. I think there's tons of knowledge and value to get out of this. Enjoy. Hi Siri, thanks for making time.
Hi, thanks for having me on your show.
Maybe as the first question, how often do people make a joke about your first name since Apple released their smart assistant?
Less and less, I will say. It was difficult there for a couple of years, but it's like kind of slowly dying off. But it's turning into, it's quite a convenient thing actually, because nowadays people know how to spell my name, whereas before I just had to kind of, there was a lot of explanation, and now I just can kind of refer to the iPhone and everyone knows.
Yeah. Maybe you can tell a little bit about where you studied and your background.
Right. I started as an industrial designer. So I went to school for industrial design in Stockholm at a school called Konstfack. And I also did an exchange semester at a school called Art Center, which is based in Pasadena, outside of LA. And as I was kind of finishing my thesis, my bachelor thesis, I did apply to the Advanced Product Design Masters in Umea and thought that I would kind of continue with my studies. But then I landed this job in Stockholm, and then I decided to go with that instead. So I had a bit of a gap there between doing my bachelor's and then going on to do my master's. But then, I worked for about 3 years in industrial design, and then I applied again to Umea. But this time I actually went for the interaction design program instead of continuing on with product design.
Mm-hmm. And you also went to Art Center, you went to Stockholm, and then at UAD. Maybe you can tell a little bit about the differences from these education programs.
Right, yeah. I'll say so Konstfack is the biggest arts school in Stockholm and in Sweden. So because it's primarily an art school, I would say you do get more of a diverse set of inspiration coming from other design and art disciplines, right? Mm-hmm. You're surrounded by people who are doing completely different things than yourself. Whereas I would say that both Art Center and Umea, they have a completely different type of focus. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to go to Art Center, actually being at Konstfack, was that to get that focus for a semester of just like drilling down and really owning in on the skills necessary to do sort of product design. But yeah, I would say that both have their advantages. I mean, Umea is an amazing environment as well, but it's definitely very much about immersing yourself in the world of industrial design and interaction design and just kind of focusing on that. Whereas, yeah, an art school can be a lot more than that, right? You get more kind of influences.
Mm-hmm. There's a great talk from you on, you spoke at UX Tartu, and they gave also, I think, great points about the intersection of industrial and interaction design, also your motivation. Maybe you can outline that a little bit about your motivation going into interaction design, actually.
Yeah. So I think, as I mentioned, I thought that I would continue doing a sort of physical product design master's, and then I, after having worked for a few years, I instead decided to go into interaction design. And I think, part of the reason for that was that a lot of the industrial design projects that I'd worked on, they were very much kind of locked down from the beginning. We were brought in on projects quite late on, and so I wanted to get in earlier, right? I wanted to work more on the strategic bits, and a lot of things have already been decided once the designers are brought in on sort of classic industrial design projects. I would say you kind of know that it's a hammer that you're going to be designing. You're not going to be like changing that brief dramatically and decide, no, we're going to make a saw instead of a hammer. No, it's going to stay a hammer. Whereas with interaction design, that initial brief is, I would say, a lot of the time much more open for discussion, right? And I also felt that interaction design was sort of where things were happening at the time. So this is about 8 years ago now that I started thinking about sort of changing over to interaction design, and there was just, interaction design just felt like it was the sort of forefront in design at the time, and like that was where things were happening. And I felt like I lacked the skills, to be honest, to actually work on those challenges. I was working at this like really small but mighty design firm in Stockholm, and increasingly like the projects that came through the door, they had aspects of interaction design in them, even though they were industrial design projects. There would be a display on something, or we would work on a phone, and then we would do some of the bits that had interaction the interaction related bits to it, and so I didn't really feel like I was equipped to take on those kind of challenges, to prototype for screen-based interactions, for example.
Interesting. I think this aspect about a more open design brief is maybe something that also maybe industrial designers have as a motivation when they go into maybe more of an interaction design direction.
For sure.
And after that, you got quite different experience. We can go to some of them. Maybe first to your experience at local projects in New York.
Right. So local projects was really one of the first shorter stints that I did as an interaction designer. I went there over summer after my first year in Umea. And really what I was looking for and what I was kind of planning on doing with, that move into interaction design was to combine those two sets of skills and to work on sort of projects that merged media and physical design. And that's really what local projects do. So for those who don't know anything about them, Local Projects is a sort of media and physical design firm that do experiences. So they worked on things like the 9/11 Memorial, the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum, and so on. So they're based out of New York, and they do a lot of their work in the US, right? But they don't just design, they also kind of produce the exhibits that they work on. So that was the first time that I was in a more production type environment. I'd only sort of seen the world of extruded aluminum and sort of injection molded plastics before when it came to production. And with local projects, really what I got some exposure to was just understanding all the parts that needed to come together to create these media experiences that they do. So I found that very fascinating. I was very interested in sort of designing for sort of public space and exhibits and so on as well, which is what they do. But then it was also, that was my first exposure to American work culture. And that can always be like a bit of a shock for Europeans. It's definitely a lot tougher than Swedish work culture. So, yeah.
How do you see the role of design in these interactive exhibition media projects? Do you think it's a sort of classic interaction design process, or how would you compare it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't do that kind of work anymore, but I have friends who do, who work on exhibition design, and I think what's compelling about that is that it really is experience first, and so it very much starts from a design perspective of thinking what the experience will be like going through an exhibition, for example, or some kind of event, right? So it's very easy.
Yeah, so more like a service design project, right?
Yeah, very much so. You think about, what are you going to come in with? What's the expectations of people? What do you want them to take away I mean, I did some of this line of work later on as well when I worked at IDEO. So it's very interesting in that sense that you own the complete experience, and you can steer it very much, you know. So that's what's really compelling about it.
Yeah, so you steer the user experience throughout the exhibition visitor journey, right? Did you map the journey out, and did you think about the touch points and what each touch point should communicate to the visitor?
Yeah. I mean, and now I'm talking just from my general experience of exhibition design, but you very much do that. You kind of go through, you think about it as like you set the stage and you're the director, right? And you have an audience coming in. So it becomes much more of a like putting on a show, which is not really, you know, it's kind of what you do all the time in design. It just becomes very very pronounced and very sort of very strong when it comes to exhibition design. But I do think you have that kind of staging aspect, whatever design project you're working on, right? And you are kind of directing this experience at all times.
True. Yeah.
But yeah, it becomes much more sort of much stronger when it comes to exhibition design.
Yeah, interesting that you describe it as a service design project. It's maybe less of a functional driven service, and maybe more about what you communicate and how do you inform the visitor on each touch point. I mean, which is also sort of a function, right?
Well, I mean, depends on how you think about function as well, because I've worked on exhibition projects at IDEO where there was like a very pronounced message that that the client wanted to get across. You know, we want visitors to come away with a sense of empathy, for example, for this particular group of people, and then your job becomes very functional in a sense. Like you go in with the same approach as when you're trying to design like a more traditional product, that you're trying to like push this message in different ways, but then it becomes much more about a cognitive challenge. You're designing for the mind instead of the hand. A lot of the times. Yeah,
exactly. So after that, you worked at multiple IDEO studios. Maybe I think what may be interesting to talk about, maybe a little bit about the cultural differences between the different locations.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think I already skipped ahead and mentioned some of the work we did there, but so I was based first in the Bay Area, doing some time in internships there, and then I after graduating moved over to the London studio. And I would say the IDEO culture is incredibly strong. So, you know, IDEO puts a lot of effort into building this great work culture, which you understand when you go and work there, that it doesn't just happen by accident. There's actually people making it happen. And I would say that means that you do feel at home when you step into a studio in another location other than the one you're based in, you know, because there is that sort of general IDEO culture. But that said, I think there's definitely like a local flavor as well as you move between, you know, both cities and continents. For example, I made really great friends in both locations that I worked, but I would say the difference is what you sort of head off to do together with your colleagues after work or on the weekend. Because in the Bay Area, I don't know if you've been, but you know, it's a very outdoorsy place. Like people go off to do cycling and hiking together. It's all about, you know, when you talk together on Fridays about what you're going to do over the weekend, it's always about leaving the city of San Francisco to go outside to do something. Whereas in London, it's much more about, you know, heading down to the pub in the corner after work.
You can't escape.
You can't escape the pub, right? So I think Bay Area is much better for your waistline. But I think London has worked better, at least for my personality. Because the Bay Area, it just suffers from this excruciating optimism, which is also, I guess, why so many successful companies come out of the Bay Area. But all that optimism can be a bit hard to handle sometimes for cynical Scandinavians like myself.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about the projects you worked at IDEO.
Yeah, well, like I mentioned, I did some exhibition projects, which were great. I have, let's see, there's an early project we did, like when I was working out of the San Francisco studio that's close to my heart. We did this project together with this Brazilian organization, designing an app that would help level the playing field basically for Brazilian kids. So we looked at digital games and diagnostics that would teach reading through sort of games and sort of fun ways of learning the basics of reading, and it would also help teachers address learning gaps in the class and kind of keep track of how students were doing. So I think. Did you travel to Brazil? Yes, for sure. So I think, like with all the sort of best projects at IDEO, or the ones that I really appreciated, a lot of the value was really added in the research phase. Immersion, when we established, together with these Brazilian educators, what the viable methods would be of learning through an app. And so we traveled for a few weeks to visit schools, both more sort of where they had a lot of resource and a lot of teachers per group of students, and also schools in areas that had more challenges in both socially and resource wise, and then talked to a lot of professionals in the space as well. So I really liked that project because I think it taught me a lot about the importance of staying humble as well as a designer. We worked a lot with sacrificial concepts, coming up with ideas that we presented to educators, for example, to get their feedback and so on. So it's very good.
Did the school bought the devices, basically?
No, so the devices were all coming from the Brazilian government. So they were the ones who had invested in in technology for the classroom, but they didn't really have anything to put on these tablets that they had invested in. That's
an interesting point, I think, at the moment, where a lot of programs they think of the device as an enabler first, but then the second thought is about what are we actually doing with the device, right? What actually education content is actually playing. Is very often people think about the hardware first, but it's actually about the content. So
yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, I think it's anyway a good direction, but yeah. Any other personal highlights from your time at IDEO?
Yeah, I would say, some of the most memorable work I did out of London was really stuff that we did together with IKEA. I found that really fascinating as well. It's a really big organization and very traditional in a sense, because they're selling physical product. But they're trying to do a lot of new things, and that's always fascinating. So yeah.
Did you work together? I think I saw it on your website, I'm not sure, on the kitchen interaction project.
Right. Yeah. So that was one of the things that we did together with IKEA. That was really interesting to and that was just going back to what we talked about before. Like that was one of those kind of staging and like thinking through an exhibition design projects that I find really interesting. It just becomes interesting as well, designing out. You designing a space, filling it with physical products made to manifest a certain idea or certain concept, and to sort of drive home a sort of a point of view, really, or an idea. And then you're also doing interaction design in that context, like designing all of those bits together. I mean, it's very luxurious, and you don't get that opportunity often as a designer. I guess that's the compelling bit about doing an exhibition.
Maybe after all your time at IDEO, what was your biggest learning about what design can drive forward?
Well, I would say like the power you have to sort of also like help people along with your process. So when you're at a design consultancy, you're always working together with other organizations that you're doing work for, right? And I think in a lot of agencies, you kind of take the brief and you go off and you produce something, you come back and present it. But at IDEO, I think a lot of the value is in involving the clients in the process, bringing them along. And so part of what you do is always about educating the organization that you're working with in sort of how to produce value through design. I think that's the kind of biggest, I guess, professional takeaway that I've had through the work there. It's really that kind of coaching and always kind of bringing the team along for what you're doing.
Interesting. And then after your time at IDEO, you moved from agency to corporate, or let's say startup. You moved to Spotify. Maybe you can tell. Yeah, maybe corporate now.
Depends on how you see it. Yeah, is Spotify still a startup or is it corporate?
Yeah. I mean, it's been growing, I guess.
Oh yeah, so much.
Maybe you can tell a little bit about your role and maybe also your motivation going.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting with you trying to define what Spotify really is. There's someone who put out the tool the other week, like internally at Spotify, where you could, just type in your name and you could find out what percentage of employees had been hired after you at Spotify. Because, at a company that's growing at the pace that Spotify's growing, if you joined 2 years ago, like me, you're already sort of old at the company. Which makes for a really sort of interesting and weird culture as well, if you're talking about culture. But yeah, you asked about sort of why I moved there. So I was looking to go back to Stockholm for personal reasons, really. It was my partner who had recently moved over. And I was considering continuing in design consulting, doing things similar to what I was doing at IDEO. But then, I ended up at Spotify, and that wasn't an easy choice. It's very different from what I'd done earlier, and I knew it would mean sort of stepping into a role that would be entirely digital, whereas at IDEO I'd still been able to go a little bit in between and be involved in physical products as well, and sort of bridge that and work a lot with service design. But Spotify is very digital, so to some extent, it was kind of like starting from the beginning to learn the ropes at a product company as well. It's incredibly different from working at a design firm. Then I think because coming to Stockholm meant I was moving back. I lived here before. I wanted something to be new, so I chose to do something new in my professional life, and decided to give Spotify a go. So that's a little over 2 years ago now.
And what is your role at Spotify?
Yeah,
maybe you can tell a bit about the products you work with. Or
Yeah, so I started working in a role with focusing on Spotify's integrations with products. So everything we do with like speakers, TVs, cars, etc. We have a lot of Sonos. Integrations. And a lot of interfaces that are owned by other companies. And so we have a whole department just looking at those kind of things. So that was quite a nice fit considering my background, right? So looking a lot at like physical devices and how Spotify would live in that ecosystem, right? But then since a year back now, I work on the mobile experience instead. So what we call core experience. And I'm focusing on how we can make the podcast experience on Spotify the best it can be. So it's interesting being on a podcast now, seeing as I've been working with podcasts in our app for the past year.
When you say you worked in the integration team, was that a design team that kind of focused on that, or was it a product team where you were the designer?
Right. Yeah, it's both, right? We don't have... Spotify doesn't have a design department that sits and just kind of spits out designs. But
no central design department.
No central design department, right? So designers are always members of product teams. And those product teams in turn own certain parts of the experience, right? So when I say I worked in that sort of part of the organization, it means I worked with different teams that owned, for example, speakers, or I worked a bit on TV with that product team. But that means working together. You're often the only designer. If you're lucky, you get a design buddy. But often it's like it's you. It's a product manager, depending on the team, you have back-end engineers, front-end engineers to different sort of balancing in different. You might have 2 front-end engineers, or you might have 6, depending on how front-end heavy it is.
Mm-hmm. And how do you align on the design of different touch points then, if there's no central design team?
So when I say we don't have a central design team, I'm talking about more like in terms of how we sit and how we function.
Okay. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, but so there's not like an internal design studio, if
got it,
you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have a design team that is looking across for alignment's sake, right?
Mm-hmm.
And make sure that we all sort of stay aligned.
Mm-hmm.
But that's like a team that has that as their task, their sole task.
So the whole task of that team is sort of touchpoint alignment, basically.
It's about mostly visual alignment, making sure that across all platforms you can recognize that this is a Spotify product. They look at the language we use, that make sure that we always use the same tone of voice, because that's also a very important part of product design, and so on. So that's sort of as close as you get to, like, I guess, the central design team.
Mm-hmm. And then you get them in at some like checkpoints towards a project, for example, to get their feedback, I guess.
Exactly, yeah. So they get involved in different. They run their own projects, developing, the identity of Spotify.
Yeah.
And then they can also help other teams to make sure that we don't go completely nuts and create some new weird, animation that doesn't exist anywhere else in the product, and so on. So yeah.
Interesting. In terms of design culture, with all the people doing design in different teams, do you have a sort of meet up, let's call it like this, or occasion where you come out together?
Yeah. So we're big now. We're really. I'm not even gonna give you a number, because it's probably gonna be wrong about like how big the design team is. But we are also based in Stockholm, New York, London. Multiple locations. But we do have something called Design Days, which happens yearly, and then we get to all meet and hang out, which is really great, because we do end up doing a lot of collaborations and stuff remotely. It really helps, having seen someone and met someone in person when you start working on projects together.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then obviously we stay connected within one location as well. So we do have a design operations team that help us stay connected and sort of make sure that we all play nicely together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you, I guess, like most of the designers working on, let's say, the visual and what's visible, but if you consider the disciplined voice experience, do you have also, for example, voice interface designers? Designed experience in terms of the audio experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of growing as a company, and growing as a design team, is that you do end up needing a lot more variety within the team. Yeah, right? Because starting out, Spotify was on, desktop and phone. It's just a couple of platforms, and I think a lot of early on and with startups, design is quite immature, and it's very focused on the visual end, as you say, right? And then it's the bigger you get, the more sort of specialized you get as well. So you still do have to start thinking about having the right tone of voice, both in writing and obviously when you start having like an actual voice of Spotify, like what is that, and so on. And it's a challenge, because we often do sort of exist on other platforms, like in a car, for example, and then how does Spotify's identity come across when it's on someone else's within someone else's experience, that someone else own.
Yeah, it's interesting with sort of that market, because the pricing around like different products of different companies are not very similar, but then still users have very distinctive preferences in terms of I want to use Spotify because that and that, or I want to use that and that service. And that's very much because the experience is so important, and you know, people really maybe stick to a certain experience, a certain design, if you want to say so.
Absolutely. And you notice when, as soon as you know if you work on the mobile experience, for example, and you reach millions and millions of users, as soon as you launch something new, or you know, introduce a change, there will be people who are very upset about that.
Yeah.
on Twitter and on Reddit, and you know, expert users who are who want it the way they've always had it. So it's a powerful feeling, but it's also quite makes you quite nervous.
Yeah.
To introduce new things. Yeah.
Maybe you can tell, like, building up on that, maybe you can talk a little bit about the impact and importance of the role of design when it comes about, you know, designing basically the future music consumption experiences.
Yeah. Well, I guess this goes for any industry really, but I always find it hard to talk about, you know, design isolation when it's within such a big company.
Yeah.
It used to be easier being at a design firm, where design is the whole focus.
Yeah.
But I think that's a side of being, you know, humble as a designer. Is I think what working at Spotify has taught me is to, you know, acknowledge all the other the role that all the other disciplines have in the process of innovation.
Absolutely.
It's not something that designers, you know, own or lead by themselves in any way. So.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I mean, that said, there are ways of approaching innovation that I think are unique to design and that everyone in the company can learn from. So I think that's the most important impact that design can have, in fact, at a big product company like Spotify. But yeah, I think, you know, when you're working on, you know, initiating this strategic changes through design, the way I did a lot with IDEO and the clients we worked with there, you kind of become accustomed to always being part of that team that's driving, you know, that's the driving force behind innovative thinking. And you're, you know, trying to push everyone in the partnering organization to approach things with this human-centered lens. But at a company like Spotify, ideas can kind of come from wherever. You know, it can start from a tech capability, or it can start from a business opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely.
That someone uncovers. So then, you know, as a designer, you start sort of running after the ball a bit late, and then you try to just steer it in a more human and needs-based direction, you know, for the benefit of the product really, and to not make it fail because that side has been overlooked, you know.
So that's like a responsibility you see for yourself at Spotify then, I guess, right?
Yeah, well, I like to think so, because I think, you know, in that kind of environment, at times it can be very much led by business needs or engineering capabilities. Oftentimes it's like a metric that your team is trying to push in a certain direction. For example, because you want to try to make people use a feature. And then I think the danger is that the design process becomes very iterative. And it's this sort of step-by-step evolution that eventually leads to, you know, creating weird monsters. And so, I would say, to me, like, the impact that we as designers can have is to relentlessly sort of be the voice of the users and get other disciplines thinking in the same way. But it's hard because, you know, I think, to me, design thinking is not really a process so much as a mindset. It's about, you know, staying open, staying optimistic, being generous, you know, building on others' ideas, all of these things that I'm sure you've heard about. And you know, you can't pick up a mindset like that just by, you know, clicking through a PowerPoint or reading an article. It's like sending an article to someone. You have to learn it through practice. Yeah. So that's when it becomes really important to bring everyone along for the process. I think that's really, to me, it's a core design skill, because if you only sort of focus on the execution part of design, I think as a designer you risk becoming someone who's just coloring in someone else's sort of ready-made drawings. You know, don't get me wrong, because I mean, there's a huge need for really high quality design execution at any product company, but I think we're selling ourselves a bit short if we say that, you know, that's all we can do or deliver as designers.
Absolutely, yeah. Great.
But then I guess you asked about the music industry really, and then I kind of shied away from that question. But I guess what's unique for working with that creative industry is that we do design for two sides of the experience. We're designing for people who are looking to consume music, and then we're designing for creators as well, for the artists.
Interesting.
And that's always an interesting thing for designers at Spotify as well, and like in terms of the impact that we can have, because that places quite high demands on the like synchronizing the teams, design teams that work on both those sides, to make sure that we design experiences that artists are interested in creating and that people are interested in consuming.
Yeah, from the complexity, I guess it's almost like having two products, right? Because it's two different user journeys, and
it is, or some, like a lot of the times it's one product, but it's two sides of it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So you have to make sure that, because we're designing something, we're just making containers for people to create into. So we have to make sure that artists are actually, and creators are actually interested in creating that content, and that there's an interest on the other side of consuming it.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of innovation,
and those are not the same, and those are not the same designers working on those two sides. So that's a challenge. Staying synced.
Yeah, I think also on especially on the creation part, I think there's a lot of let's say design innovation happening in terms of democratizing, for example, podcast creation, and kind of enabling people these tools. I think there's looking at the creation part, I think there's also a lot of innovation happening in the industry. Yeah. For
sure, yeah, and that's really interesting, because you can't really guide it as a designer. Yeah, if you're creating a tool for creation, a creative tool.
You're designing stage, right?
Yeah, all you can do is like you put something out in the world, and then you see where, what creators do, how they run with it. Either they go like, nah, can't really use this is not great, or maybe they love it, but they use it in a completely different way than you intended. But the output is
how they hack it.
Yeah,
right?
they hack it for their needs, and the output can be amazing. It's like better than anything you imagined, and so it's a really fascinating area to be working in.
As I said, you gave a very interesting talk at UX Tartu, and I think especially your points about the intersection of industrial and interaction design were very interesting. Maybe you can outline that again, especially maybe the example you gave around form follows service, in terms, for example, the speaker example, maybe something very interesting for the audience to hear about.
Okay, yeah, sure. And so in this talk that I did at UX Tartu, I think the sort of general theme of that talk was the tendency that we've been seeing in the past few years of how smartphones and connected products are making industrial design and interaction design come together again after having for a long time been happening in silos. And what that leads to, which is that you can kind of choose what form something takes. So you can, some things that have been physical for a very long time, forever, are now really well suited to become an app. And then other things that have for the longest time been locked behind the screen can then benefit from being extended into the physical world. And so I think that the example that you mentioned there with the speakers, where that's one case with connected speakers where you can choose to manifest certain features if you so wish. So they're really built together with services backing them up. So you can have a physical switch that let you flip between playlists that you picked out yourself in an accompanying app, for example, right? Yeah. So it really means that, and that's probably the reason, that app and the fact that you can sync up your playlists to your speaker, that's probably the reason why you go out and buy it. So the service that you sell the product with, that ends up informing what the product looks like in the end. But then obviously like the industrial design is just as important, maybe even more important, because that's where the service manifests. So yeah, I find that really interesting, and it's like a development that I've sort of been hoping to see. And I guess the more I talk about it, the closer to reality I can bring it, because the more people talk about things, the truer they become.
Maybe another great example for the audience would to learn about the example you gave about hardware motion in hinges in comparison to digital elements. Maybe you can outline that as well.
Yes, I think what's interesting for designers when it comes to this development, what's interesting to think about really for designers, is that a lot of the principles, the underlying principles for design are really the same, right? So whether you're coming from industrial design or interaction design, you are going to run into, the more we see of this, the more you're going to run into projects where you do work both ends, or you do come in contact with the other discipline. But then you can kind of rest assured that the same principles apply. And so one of those examples that I had was around hinges, and how, I guess that's one of the more sort of philosophical examples, but it's true that, like, you look to hinges in physical design, they're great enablers of feature, but they also sort of, every hinge you introduce is a possible point where things risk breaking, which you kind of know if you've been designing for a while, that things that fall together are not often like the best products to use, even though they're very convenient. And the same thing kind of applies in digital design, in that we design a lot of sort of in-betweens, and if you do that well, and if you design those sort of interaction hinges well, then products become really delightful and amazing to use. But equally, it's a great way of breaking a product is to fail in those hinge experiences. I mean, in interaction design, the way you usually talk about this is in terms of seamful design, is the concept that's usually sort of referred for this.
I think we're going to put a link of your talk at UX Tattoo on the description also. I think it might be interesting to the audience maybe to learn also some of the other examples you gave. The sneaker example comes into my mind. But maybe going forward, I mean, you graduated in 2014, but you got quite a bit of experience in the industry. So maybe, I know the industry is moving fast. So maybe did you saw interaction design at large maybe also evolving already in your career? And maybe where do you see it going forward in the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, the way I sort of outtrace things in the talk, it starts already in 2005 when I sort of started my industrial design path.
There you can see a lot of development.
Yeah, and so I guess the sort of irony or the takeaway from the talk I did is that I've always been like a little bit behind.
Pre-iPhone.
Yeah, I mean, that was pre-iPhone, and I sort of got into design not knowing what was going to happen. Like, I mean, I guess no one really knows what's going to happen, but I feel like I've always been a bit late on the ball with like, oh, wait, like this is maybe not what I want to do. I want to, do interaction design instead and so on. And then there's always like already like so many interesting things happening in that area. What was the question again? How I see it evolving? I mean,
yeah. How do you saw and see it evolving in the future?
I mean, I guess when I started or when I got into interaction design, that was when the mobile phone was like all the rage. Like the smartphone was just this like one product that ruled, and I think that is if it hasn't changed already, it's about to change, and it's going to be very interesting to see what the next paradigm is going to be, because smartphone has been like the thing for 10 years now, and I think it must or will change. Either the phones themselves will change somehow, and apps will no longer be like the main way of interacting with the phone, or we'll look to another type of device in the near future. But I think that's the maturity of the smartphone is the biggest sort of thing that I've been able to see. Just looking back like 10 years, I really hope that the reason I went into interaction design was never really to just design for this glowing rectangle. That was not sort of what I was hoping for.
The intent.
I was always hoping to be able to combine it with physical design and sort of be, I guess, I wouldn't call it a new type of designer, but the type of designer that would have one leg in each world and sort of bridge across that. And so I'm still sort of waiting for that, because I don't think we've quite seen that yet happen, that these two things are designed in tandem. It's like it's like the ideal state that I'm hoping for, and that I think it's happening on small projects and on sort of you see it at design schools, you've seen it at smaller design studios for many years, but it hasn't become mainstream yet, and no bigger product companies are really like successfully doing that yet, and there's still way too much of we do the physical product first, and then we design for the screen that sits on that device, or for the little knob that you're going to turn, or whatever. It's like it doesn't happen as it should. Sort of two things at once. I guess you see more of it, but not enough. So that's what my hope would be, I guess, which you haven't asked for, but I'm telling you my hope is for the next 10 years is that's going to be the main thing that drives design, and that designers are going to adopt more and more, is to always have to think about these two things as one, because it is one experience in the end, and that's the way it should be designed.
Maybe as a last question, what would be your advice for a young industrial design student, and then also for a young interaction design student?
I don't know. Like I was saying, I don't know if I'm the best suited at giving advice, since I've been like one step behind. But I think for industrial designers, like I think I mentioned this in my talk as well, is that you just have to. You're not going to be able to avoid this exposure to UX or interaction design. So you better stay curious and become good at understanding complex systems, which is not something that industrial design schools traditionally teach, because there's so much else that you need to learn, so many other skills, right? But products extend like to a bigger and bigger extent becomes part of different types of infrastructures, and it doesn't really, the story doesn't end when the product leaves the factory anymore. So it's going to become part of, different types of complex service systems that you're going to need to understand and design for. So I guess the advice is really to become better at sort of grasping those systems that you're designing for, and think about that layer of service that's always going to be there in the future. And then for interaction design, or people who come into UX, I think that's even harder to advise for, because people are streaming into that field from so many different places right now. And I think my tribe of, people who have worked in industrial design and then go over to do UX were a very small group. Yeah. And a lot of people are coming from, computer science and so on. But I think generally for that exact reason, that people are coming from, graphic design or computer science, there are more and more like specialized interaction design programs today as well. Yeah. If you're coming from more of a flat world, so to speak, I think it's wise to start thinking about embracing these possibilities that go outside of the screen, the physical possibilities of what you design. Start questioning why everything needs to be display based. I think that's going to seem like a very old school way of thinking in just a few years. To we need to interact with this, so you just plop it on the screen, put some buttons there, and we're done. That's going to feel like very old fashioned, very narrow minded. Yeah, very old fashioned very soon. So we need to sort of dare to, engage more senses, more of our human senses in interactions. That's what you can learn from industrial design.
Yep.
Really.
All right, Siri, that was great. Thanks for sharing all your knowledge.
Thanks for having me on your show.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks.
That was the episode. If you want to give us feedback on the podcast, have something to contribute to the next episode, or just want to get in touch, feel free to connect with us either on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram messages, or simply via the designdrives.org website. We love to hear from you.